What really happens when we die? Not in poetry, not in metaphor, but in reality. It's a question we've all asked, whether quietly in the depths of a sleepless night, or in the raw, aching silence after losing someone. It's a question that has haunted humanity for as long as we've been able to imagine our own end. And yet, for all our science, all our philosophy, and all our spiritual traditions, the moment of death remains a shadow, a boundary we all must cross, but none can. Report from religions promise us heavens and hells. Atheists tell us it's nothingness. Scientists speak of neurons fading into quiet, while mystics whisper of journeys through light and space. But behind all these theories, the same fear remains, a fear older than civilization itself. We don't fear the pain of death as much as we fear the uncertainty of what comes after. But what if that uncertainty wasn't necessary? What if someone or something had already mapped the path, hidden in the mountains of Tibet, buried in an esoteric language few can read? There exists an ancient book. It's not a work of fiction. It's not a metaphor. It's a manual. A manual written not to entertain or to enlighten in abstract terms, but to be read aloud to the dying, guiding their consciousness step by step through what happens after the body gives out. This book is not an obscure religious text gathering dust. For centuries, it has been used practically by monks and lay people alike, during real moments of death, as a kind of spiritual GPS for the soul. And the most disturbing part, the book doesn't just offer answers about the afterlife, it offers instructions. It doesn't simply describe what comes next. It tries to prepare you for it. This is the story of that book, what it claims, what it reveals, and why some believe it holds the most important knowledge we've ignored, not because it's comforting, but because it's terrifyingly precise. High in the cold, thin air of the Himalayan mountains, where the boundary between life and death seems blurred by altitude and silence, an ancient manuscript has passed quietly through generations, inked by hand, chanted aloud in funerals, and memorized by monks. It is known not by its poetic name, but by its purpose, the great liberation through hearing in the Bardo, or more simply, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. But despite its name, it isn't a book for the dead. It's a guide for the dying. Unlike the spiritual texts of other traditions, which speak of the afterlife in metaphors or riddles, the Bardo Fiddle reads like a survival manual, structured, instructional, urgent. It was designed not for scholars or clergy, but for practical use in a moment of ultimate crisis, the moment consciousness begins to separate from the body. In Tibetan Buddhist culture, death is not a sudden end, but a process, a disintegration of identity and perception. And according to this tradition, the most critical decisions of one's entire existence are made not in life, but in the hours and days after death. That's where the Bardo Fiddle comes in. For centuries, it has been read aloud to the dying and to the recently dead. A voice, present and familiar, becomes their compass. As the body cools and ceases function, the consciousness, still active, enters what the Tibetans call the Bardo, an intermediate state between death and rebirth. But this state is not peaceful. It's not a tunnel of light or a blissful reunion. It's a psychological labyrinth. Here, the mind is no longer tethered to the body, but it doesn't dissolve either. It turns inward, and what it encounters in this inward collapse is a torrent of lights, visions, deities, fears, and illusions, all projections of itself. The Bardo Fiddle, then, is a map through that terrain. It instructs the dying person, or the consciousness, wherever it is, to recognize the illusions it sees. It warns of terrifying wrathful figures who are not external demons, but unacknowledged parts of one's psyche. It explains that the bright light one sees is the pure nature of reality, and the more frightening it seems, the closer one is to truth. The book's purpose is simple, liberation, but the method is not. It calls on the dying to recognize what is happening in real time, to resist the temptation to grasp, to remember the teachings, and to choose to dissolve the ego entirely, rather than be pulled back into the cycle of rebirth. The symbolism is dense, the language archaic, the imagery surreal, and yet, beneath the surface is something deeply psychological, a confrontation with fear, identity, desire, and the very structure of the self. The origins of this text trace back to Padmasambhava, the 8th century Indian mystic credited with bringing Buddhism to Tibet. Legend holds that he dictated the teachings and hid them in the earth and in the minds of his followers, to be discovered at the right time. Hundreds of years later, the book was revealed by a Tibetan mystic who claimed he had uncovered it through divine vision. Skeptics might see this as religious myth-making, and perhaps it is. But what makes the Bardo Thiddle so compelling, even to modern psychologists, is not its mysticism, but its precision. It doesn't speak vaguely of judgment or paradise. It describes, in vivid and structured stages, what one will see, feel, fear, and face, with detailed instructions for how to navigate each experience. Modern readers have likened it to a psychedelic trip manual. Others compare it to a Gungian dream map. Carl Jung himself was fascinated by the Bardo Thiddle, calling it an unparalleled description of the disintegration of the ego and the flooding of archetypal imagery from the unconscious. In many ways, this ancient text, born in a world of incense, snow, and silent temples, feels shockingly modern, because its core idea is this: when you die, you don't go anywhere new, you enter yourself entirely. And if you're not prepared to face what lives inside you, the rage, the sorrow, the desire, the fear, you will flee, you'll reach for the familiar, you'll cling to identity, and you'll be reborn into another cycle, repeating everything again. The Tibetan Book of the Dead doesn't offer comfort. It offers awareness, and in that awareness, it claims, is your only chance at liberation. This is not a doctrine asking you to believe. It is a manual demanding you wake up, even at the very edge of existence, because according to its pages, death is not the end. It is the beginning of the most important test you will ever face, and you'll be facing it alone, with only your mind as your battlefield. The moment of death, according to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, is not a single event. It is a journey through 3 stages called Bardo's H, more intense, more symbolic, and more revealing than the last. This is not the descent into an abyss. This is the unveiling of the mind, layer by layer, mask by mask, illusion by illusion. The first Bardo is known as Chikhai Bardo, the moment of death itself. It begins when the final breath leaves the body. Here, the experience is said to be immediate and brilliant, a blinding, all-encompassing light. It's not a light in the physical sense, but something beyond comprehension and experience, of pure awareness. This light is not a being, not a place. It is you, without the layers, without the fear, without the ego. But the terrifying paradox is this: for most, the light is too overwhelming. The mind, trained its whole life to identify with form, narrative, and separation, recoils. The individual does not recognize the light as their true nature. It's like being handed absolute freedom and instinctively rejecting it. Instead of merging with it, the consciousness turns away. The chance at liberation is lost, and the journey continues. The second stage begins. See Chönyid Bardo, the Bardo of visions. This is where the terrain begins to twist. This is where the illusions begin. The consciousness, now disoriented, begins to see forms beautiful deities, lights of different colors, and eventually, wrathful figures. But these beings are not real in the material sense. They are symbols, projections, fragments of the mind. The peaceful deities represent clarity, compassion, and wisdom. They arrive first, gentle and radiant. But as the days pass in this liminal realm, the energies shift. The wrathful deities appear, next fierce, grotesque, sometimes violent. But the book makes one thing clear. These are not punishments. They are the reflections of everything the person refused to face while alive. Repressed anger, guilt, grief, shame, fear, every ignored emotion, every suppressed trauma, every unintegrated shadow. These are the monsters that come to greet us, not to harm us, but to show us the truth of who we were. For those who recognize this, there is still a chance to awaken, to see that nothing here is real, that these are all self-created projections. But most people run. Just as the mind fled from the brilliant light of Chikhai, it now flees from the darker visions of Chönyid, and so the journey continues, deeper, into illusion. Sidpa Bardo, the Bardo of becoming. Here, the pull of rebirth begins. The consciousness, lost and desperate, seeks something familiar, a form, an identity, a life. It starts to perceive visions of potential parents, potential lives. But this is not a rational process. It is driven by karma, by habitual tendencies, unresolved desires, and attachments. The individual is drawn toward a new birth, not because they choose it consciously, but because they're pulled by everything they never let go of. Fear becomes craving. Craving becomes choice. Choice becomes incarnation. And the cycle begins again. In this final stage, we are not judged by an external God. We are not assigned punishment or reward. We simply gravitate toward what we resonate with, what we believe, what we fear, what we still need to learn. This is not a doctrine asking you to believe. It is a manual demanding you wake up, even at the very edge of existence. Because according to its pages, death is not the end. It is the beginning of the most important test you will ever face, and you'll be facing it alone, with only your mind as your battlefield. The moment of death, according to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, is not a single event. It is a journey through 3 stages called Bardo's H, more intense, more symbolic, and more revealing than the last. This is not the descent into an abyss. This is the unveiling of the mind, layer by layer, mask by mask, illusion by illusion. The first Bardo is known as Chikhai Bardo, the moment of death itself. It begins when the final breath leaves the body. Here, the experience is said to be immediate and brilliant, a blinding, all-encompassing light. It's not a light in the physical sense, but something beyond comprehension and experience, of pure awareness. This light is not a being, not a place. It is you, without the layers, without the fear, without the ego. But the terrifying paradox is this: for most, the light is too overwhelming. The mind, trained its whole life to identify with form, narrative, and separation, recoils. The individual does not recognize the light as their true nature. It's like being handed absolute freedom and instinctively rejecting it. Instead of merging with it, the consciousness turns away. The chance at liberation is lost, and the journey continues. The second stage begins. See Chönyid Bardo, the Bardo of visions. This is where the terrain begins to twist. This is where the illusions begin. The consciousness, now disoriented, begins to see forms, beautiful deities, lights of different colors, and eventually, wrathful figures. But these beings are not real in the material sense. They are symbols, projections, fragments of the mind. The peaceful deities represent clarity, compassion, and wisdom. They arrive first, gentle and radiant. But as the days pass in this liminal realm, the energies shift. The wrathful deities appear, next fierce, grotesque, sometimes violent. But the book makes one thing clear. These are not punishments. They are the reflections of everything the person refused to face while alive. Repressed anger, guilt, grief, shame, fear, every ignored emotion, every suppressed trauma, every unintegrated shadow. These are the monsters that come to greet us, not to harm us, but to show us the truth of who we were. For those who recognize this, there is still a chance to awaken, to see that nothing here is real, that these are all self-created projections. But most people run. Just as the mind fled from the brilliant light of Chikhai, it now flees from the darker visions of Chönyid, and so the journey continues, deeper, into illusion. Sidpa Bardo, the Bardo of becoming. Here, the pull of rebirth begins. The consciousness, lost and desperate, seeks something familiar, a form, an identity, a life. It starts to perceive visions of potential parents, potential lives. But this is not a rational process. It is driven by karma, by habitual tendencies, unresolved desires, and attachments. The individual is drawn toward a new birth, not because they choose it consciously, but because they're pulled by everything they never let go of. Fear becomes craving. Craving becomes choice. Choice becomes incarnation. And the cycle begins again. In this final stage, we are not judged by an external God. We are not assigned punishment or reward. We simply gravitate toward what we resonate with, what we believe, what we fear, what we still need to learn. The Sidpa, Bardo, is a mirror. It reflects back, not just who we were, but who we believed we were. If we lived in clinging, we're pulled back to the world of grasping. If we lived in delusion, we're pulled back into confusion. If we lived with awareness, with courage, with wisdom, there is a moment here, too, where liberation is possible, but it's rare. And so, for most, the cycle of death and rebirth continues. What Buddhists call samsara. What's haunting is not just the mysticism of these stages, but how closely they mirror the findings of modern psychology. In the Chikhai Bardo, we see echoes of ego death, reported in near-death experiences, and Haida's psychedelic journeys. The sensation of losing the self, merging with the universe, experiencing a boundless, blinding light. These are common themes in DMT research, psilocybin therapy, and LSD. Studies. Chönyid, Bardo's terrifying visions, parallel what psychologists might call the surfacing of the unconscious mind. Carl Jung described this as a confrontation with the shadow, the parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. When these parts rise up, they can feel like external forces, like demons or gods. But they are us, and Sidpa Bardo. It mirrors what many trauma theorists describe as reenactment, the compulsion to repeat patterns until they are understood and healed. Even birth itself, in Sidpa, is not an event. It is a karmic trajectory, a loop, determined by the mind's inability to let go. In this way, the Bardos aren't simply stages after death. They are psychological landscapes. Maps of the human mind under extreme pressure. And according to the Tibetan tradition, what happens in these realms is not dictated by divine judgment. It's dictated by recognition. Can you recognize the light as yourself? Can you recognize the fear as your own projection? Can you recognize your craving, your resistance, your suffering as something optional, not absolute? Because if you can, you don't need to be reborn. You can wake up, even in death, and perhaps, even in life. At this point, you might be wondering how much of this is just symbolic language. Are we interpreting ancient poetry as psychological truth? Are the Bardos just myths dressed in metaphors? It's a fair question, and an important one. To answer it, we have to shift perspectives. Step out of the monastery, out of the chanting halls of Tibetan mysticism, and into the fluorescent corridors of modern science. Neuroscience labs, hospitals, and fMRI imaging rooms. Because strangely enough, what the mystics described centuries ago, the luminous visions, the dissolving ego, the cycling through fear and peace, may not be so different from what modern researchers are beginning to observe in the final moments of life. Let's begin with what happens at the point of death. In recent years, doctors studying brain activity in patients on the verge of death made a startling discovery. Just seconds after the heart stops, the brain doesn't go quiet. It flares. A sudden surge of gamma waves associated with conscious awareness, memory, recall, and heightened perception fires across the brain. In some cases, The activity is even more intense than normal waking consciousness. This phenomenon has been nicknamed the last burst, and it's reshaping how we think about the dying process. Some scientists speculate it could explain the vivid experiences reported in near-death accounts, tunnels of light, out-of-body perspectives, and life reviews. But this also sounds eerily similar to the Chikhai Bardo, the moment of death described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, where consciousness is said to encounter a blinding light, the clear light of awareness, before dissolving or recoiling. Then there's DMT. Dimethyltryptamine is a naturally occurring psychedelic compound produced in the human body. It's found in trace amounts in the pineal gland and other tissues. Some researchers suggest that at the moment of death, the body may release a flood of DMT, triggering vivid, dreamlike visions. Those who have taken synthetic DMT often report encounters with strange beings, overwhelming lights, feelings of ego death, and complete time distortion. In many ways, it mirrors not just the Chikhai Bardo, but also the visionary and symbolic chaos of the Chönyid Bardo. And what about the final stage, the Sidpa Bardo, where craving leads to rebirth? Trauma therapists and neuroscientists have long noted that the human mind is not a linear machine. It's cyclical. Trauma repeats in loops, behaviors, echo patterns. We reenact the same relationships, fears, and failures not because we want to, but because some part of us is trying to resolve them. This is not mystical, it's psychological. It's the unconscious dragging us through familiar terrain, hoping we'll see something differently this time. Until we do, the cycle continues. In this light, rebirth isn't about reincarnation in the literal sense. It's about psychological repetition. The patterns we live, the roles we play, the karmic scripts we repeat. Carl Jung called this the collective unconscious, the vast, shared repository of symbols, archetypes, and stories that shape our minds beneath the surface. He believed that death stripped away the ego and exposed the psyche to this raw landscape of myth and memory. In fact, Jung once said the Tibetan Book of the Dead was the most profound account of psychological disintegration he had ever read. He didn't see it as primitive mysticism, but as a kind of ancient map of the human mind. When it is no longer bound by the body, even the wrathful and peaceful deities, so bizarre and terrifying to the Western eye, can be understood as archetypes, not literal beings, but psychological truths, representations of inner forces, anger, compassion, fear, desire, shame, hope. To the unprepared mind, these forces feel external, alien, like gods or demons, but they are simply parts of ourselves, parts we fail to integrate in life, and are forced to confront in death. Now consider Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's famous 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Originally conceived as a model for how we process loss, it has since become a framework for how we confront our own mortality. Interestingly, the progression of these stages bears resemblance to the transitions through the bardos. Denial mirrors the recoiling from the clear light. Anger and bargaining reflect the confrontations in the visionary bardo. Depression, the surrender. And finally, acceptance, the potential for liberation or rebirth. None of this is proof. And to be fair, the Tibetan Book of the Dead doesn't ask for belief. It offers a model, a story, a structure. But what's remarkable is how deeply this ancient structure aligns with what we are only now beginning to glimpse through the lens of science, psychology, and lived experience. Maybe that's because the Tibetans weren't trying to explain death as an external event. They were trying to explain what it feels like to let go of the self. They were mapping the inside of a collapse, the falling away of everything we think we are, and in doing so, they may have uncovered something timeless, a psychological model disguised as scripture, a mystical roadmap that points not to heaven or hell but to the very architecture of the human psyche under existential pressure. What we fear most at the end may not be the darkness, it may be the moment we finally see ourselves without distortion and realize we've been running from that mirror all along. At this point, you might be wondering how much of this is just symbolic language. Are we interpreting ancient poetry as psychological truth? Are the bardos just myths dressed in metaphors? It's a fair question, and an important one, to find the answer. We must shift our lens step away from the temples, the chanting monks, and the sacred scrolls. Step into the world of machines and measurements, into sterile hospital rooms and the humming silence of neuroscience labs. Because strangely, what ancient mystics described in metaphor, modern science may be capturing in data. Let's start at the moment of death. For decades, we assumed that when the heart stops, the brain follows. Silence, a black void. But in recent years, a startling discovery has rewritten that narrative in a study that shook the medical world. Researchers monitoring brain activity in patients moments before and after cardiac arrest found something unexpected. Just seconds after the heart stopped, the brain didn't fade. It ignited a sudden surge of gamma wave activity, the kind associated with heightened consciousness. Memory flashbacks and perceptions swept through the brain. In some cases, the activity was stronger than during waking life. This isn't science fiction. It's known as the last burst, a final flare of awareness at the threshold of death, and it bears a striking resemblance to what the Tibetan Book of the Dead calls the Chikhai Bardo, the moment when consciousness encounters the clear light of awareness, a radiant presence beyond all form, before either dissolving into it or recoiling in fear. In both models, ancient and modern, there is no immediate disappearance. Instead, there is intensity, a magnification of presence, a heightened encounter. Now enter DMT, dimethyltryptamine, powerful psychedelic, naturally produced in small amounts in the human body. Scientists have found traces of it in the pineal gland, often associated with mystical states in spiritual traditions, but its full function remains a mystery. Some researchers hypothesize that, in moments of extreme stress or death, the body may flood itself with DMT. This chemical release could trigger intense, dreamlike visions, light tunnels, encounters with non-human entities, complete ego dissolution. Those who have taken synthetic DMT often describe being overwhelmed by indescribable geometries, voices, beings, and a sense of being pulled outside of space and time. It sounds fantastical until you compare it to the Chönyid Bardo, the second stage described in. And in that moment of raw clarity, when nothing stands between us and the mirror, what we fear most may not be the unknown. It may be the sudden realization that the thing we've been running from was never death. It was ourselves. The final choice is not made in a celestial courtroom. It's not dictated by gods or fate. It's made in silence within the most intimate chambers of the human psyche. According to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, after passing through the chaotic, often terrifying bardos, a soul meets its final fork in the road, liberation or rebirth. But let's pause. What does liberation even mean? To a monk meditating on a Himalayan peak, it might mean dissolving the ego, recognizing that there is no fixed self, and merging into the infinite. To a trauma survivor in a therapist's office, it might mean finally letting go of the past, breaking free from the internal loops of pain. In either case, the core principle is the same: freedom from repetition, freedom from the pull of past identities, fears, and unhealed wounds. In the Tibetan cosmology, rebirth isn't necessarily a punishment. It's more like a gravitational force. Karma, action, intention, habit draws the soul back into a new body, a new situation, another chance, but also another cycle, another forgetting, another round of suffering. The soul doesn't escape, because it's still entangled with desire, with fear, with unfinished business. Modern psychology has a strikingly similar concept. Carl Jung spoke of complexes, patterns of thoughts and emotions rooted in past experiences that shape our present behavior, often unconsciously. When we don't integrate these parts of ourselves, we live them out again and again, caught in psychological samsara. How many of us live in this rebirth loop every day? We wake up with intentions, but fall into the same emotional reactions. We say we want change, but choose the familiar pain over the unknown healing. We cling to identity, even if it suffocates us. A bad relationship ends, but the next one mirrors it. A job becomes toxic, but we walk into the same structure elsewhere. New face, same story. This is the Sidpa Bardo, not in the afterlife but in real life. In this final stage of the Bardo journey, the soul is no longer bombarded by visions or gods. Instead, it begins to feel the pull, the craving for a new form, the hunger for continuity. The idea of I am emerges again, subtle, seductive. The illusion of a separate self begins to congeal, magnetized by karma. And suddenly, the opportunity for liberation slips through the fingers. A new life begins. But there is another option. The Tibetan texts say, if the soul recognizes the true nature of reality, the clear light, the emptiness of ego, it can break free. It can awaken from the dream. It can exit the cycle. Psychologically, this mirrors what happens in deep inner work. In therapy, when a person finally confronts their core wound, sees the false beliefs it created, and chooses to let it go, stop repeating the pattern, they step off the wheel. They don't just feel better, they become someone new. Or perhaps, they remember who they always were underneath the conditioning. This is not an easy path. Liberation means the death of what we thought we were. The roles, the defenses, the narratives that made us feel safe. To surrender those things can feel terrifying. That's why so few choose it. Most cling, most return. But those who do let go fully, deeply, they don't need another lifetime to awaken. They do it now, in this breath, in this moment. So maybe the Bardos aren't just a post-death map. Maybe they describe the terrains of transformation. The moment of crisis, when everything dissolves. The hallucinatory chaos of emotion and memory. The pull of identity trying to reform. And finally, the decision: rebirth into the same old pattern, or liberation into something greater. Modern trauma theory echoes this. A person experiences a trigger. Their nervous system floods. Old wounds resurface. The brain seeks meaning. In chaos, emotions appear like wrathful deities. And then, if supported, if aware, the person can pause, breathe, witness, choose differently. That pause, is the crack where light enters. That is the doorway to liberation. But it's small, and fleeting, and so often missed. So the question is not just, what happens after we die? The deeper question is, what are we doing with our lives right now? Are we living consciously? Or are we simply reacting again and again, pulled by invisible threads of conditioning? Are we aware of our internal bardos, the spaces between identities, the cracks in our ego, the rawness after failure, heartbreak, or loss? Or do we rush to fill them, to escape them, to be reborn into the next distraction? Every day we die a little. Every day we face a moment where the old self no longer fits, and in that space, we have a choice: rebirth or liberation. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, then, may not be a book about literal death. It may be a guide for navigating transformation, those terrifying, beautiful, liminal spaces where we are no longer who we were, and not yet who we will become. In that space, everything is possible. But only if we can stay present. Only if we can see the illusion for what it is. Only if we're willing to let go. And maybe that's the ultimate secret. The most ancient, most powerful truth buried in the pages of this mysterious text. You don't have to wait to die to wake up. The Bardos are already here. The gods and demons are inside you. The light is within reach. So the next time your life crumbles, when everything familiar slips away, and you're suspended in the unknown, remember, this is your Bardo, and the choice is yours. Will you be reborn into the same story? Or will you finally be free? 7. The world today. Why we've forgotten how to die. Word count. Approximately 700 in the sterile glow of hospital lights. Behind closed curtains and clinical terms, death has been turned into a private malfunction. It happens somewhere else, to someone else, in a place we don't want to be, with words we don't want to hear. But this was not always the case. For most of human history, death was not a glitch in the system. It was a rite of passage, as visible, as shared, and as meaningful as birth itself. Today, we've hidden it. We outsource it. We sanitize and suppress it behind euphemisms and pharmaceuticals. And in doing so, we've lost something vital, not just about death, but about life itself. Our ancestors lived with death. It was beside them, not behind glass. Children saw grandparents die. Villages mourned together. There were chants, prayers, and fires lit under the open sky. Cultures built entire mythologies, not to escape death, but to give it shape, to make sense of it. The Tibetan Book of the Dead was one such mythology, not a fantasy, but a mirror, not a belief system, but a psychological map, a preparation. But in our time, preparation has been replaced by denial. Death, we are told, is a failure, a defeat of medicine, of youth, of progress. Entire industries have emerged to delay, disguise, and distract us from aging. Creams, biohacking, cryogenics. Even our language reveals the aversion. She passed. He's gone. We lost her. The word dead feels too raw, too real, too final. We've built a culture where death is the one subject we never learned how to talk about until it's too late. But why does this matter? Isn't avoiding pain a form of evolution? Not exactly. Avoiding death hasn't made us braver. It's made us anxious, restless. We scroll endlessly, binge-watch distractions, and optimize productivity as if running from a shadow. And beneath all that noise is a subtle, collective fear, not just of dying, but of dying without meaning. We're not afraid of death. We're afraid of dying unconsciously. That's what the Tibetan Book of the Dead tries to teach, that consciousness at the time of death is the final test of awareness, that how you meet your end reveals how you lived, that ignoring death is ignoring the one truth that defines us all. In Tibetan tradition, they didn't whisper goodbye in the ears of the dying. They read sacred what if we've misunderstood everything. What if the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bardo Fiddle, is not poetry, not allegory, not a relic of mystical folklore, but a literal manual, not a myth we outgrew, but a truth we forgot. For centuries, monks sat by the dying and whispered its verses, not to comfort, but to awaken. They believed that when the body dies, the mind does not vanish. It unfolds. It enters the Bardo, an in-between world, a liminal space where everything you believed about yourself is stripped away. There, in the absence of a body, only your consciousness remains, raw, untethered, surrounded by lights, visions, and deities that are not external beings, but projections of your own psyche, your fears, your desires, your ego, screaming for permanence. Now imagine for a moment that this is not a symbolic passage. Imagine it's real. Imagine that death is not the end of awareness, but the beginning of something far more surreal, a psychological crucible where your life flashes, not before your eyes, but through your very being, where every grudge, every act of kindness, every lie you told yourself becomes the terrain through which your soul must walk. Alone, and in that terrain, the clear light appears, pure, infinite, terrifying in its simplicity, the total dissolution of the ego, a brilliance so overwhelming that only the most prepared can merge with it. The rest recoil. They grasp. They search for something familiar. And that is when the illusions begin. A parade of visions. some beautiful, some monstrous, all reflections of you. The peaceful deities come first, radiating calm, compassion, truth. But if your mind cannot accept them, cannot recognize them as your own deeper nature, they pass. And then come the wrathful ones, grotesque, violent, frightening. Not because they are evil, but because they are your unprocessed darkness, anger, lust, ambition, attachment, everything you've never faced in life, now amplified without the buffer of the body. What if that's the real judgment day, not a courtroom in the sky, but an encounter with the unfiltered mirror of your own mind? And what if failing to recognize these illusions means returning, again, rebirth, not as a blessing, but as repetition? Not because the universe demands it, but because you couldn't let go, because your attachments to your name, your face, your beliefs still have a gravitational pull, because even in death, you weren't ready to surrender. This idea isn't just Tibetan, it echoes through other ancient traditions too. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the heart is weighed against a feather. In the Greek underworld, souls drink from the river Lethe to forget. In Christianity, purgatory is a place of cleansing before release. Different symbols, same message. The moment after death is not blankness, it is reckoning. But today, most of us live as if none of that matters. We chase achievement, avoid discomfort, and numb ourselves with dopamine loops, scrolling, consuming, performing. We construct personalities instead of discovering our essence. We rehearse roles instead of embracing awareness, and when death arrives, sudden or slow, we are caught unprepared. Not because we didn't believe in something, but because we were never truly awake. So, ask yourself, not tomorrow, not when you're old, but now. If you were to die tonight, would you be ready? Would you recognize the clear light? Would you dissolve into it, or cling to the idea of you? Would you meet the peaceful deities with calm, or shrink in fear at the wrathful ones? Would you be conscious or sedated, confused, lost? The Bardo fiddle was never meant to be entertainment or escapism. It was a guide, a manual, for the one journey we all must take alone. And maybe, just maybe, it's right. Maybe life isn't about avoiding death. Maybe it's about preparing for it, training the mind to stay present when the illusions come, to see through the projections, to wake up from the dream, because death does not make you wise. It reveals who you already were, and in the end, this may be the only truth that matters. To die well, you must live awake,